What's up, everybody? Rob here. So, this is a continuation of my look at early modern warfare, and specifically, I'm going to be talking about the reforms of the Lion of Midnight himself, the father of modern warfare, Gustavus Adolphus. Okay, that's it for intros. I'm going right into it. Let's do this. So, warfare in the 17th century, or at least the early 17th century, was dominated by the tercio, which was a pike block formation, very similar to that of the Macedonians that were used by Alexander the Great and his father, King Philip. And eventually, though, a Dutch thinker by the name of Maurice of Nassau reintroduced military tactics akin to that of the Romans. It would be made up of a number of smaller battalions, which were faster and easier to maneuver than the large pike blocks of the Spanish tercio and also other places as well. And although his ideas did gain traction throughout Europe, it was very popular, and the Dutch revolt against the Spanish was basically a school of warfare where people traveled from around Europe to basically learn how to fight. It did take some time for these new methods to catch on, and by the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618, the Spanish tercio was still basically the default form of warfare. However, one place that the reforms of Maurice of Nassau did gain some traction would be in Sweden. And when Gustavus Adolphus came to the throne in age 17 in 1611, he adopted many of the reforms of Maurice and used these plans to overhaul the Swedish military. Upon his ascension to the throne, Sweden was a sparsely populated backwater with a lethargic economy and a rather ramshackle military, something basically made up of semi-feudal levies that were simply not sufficient for the ambitions that Gustavus had. Just like his inspiration, Maurice of Nassau, his first task was to update and streamline the administration of his nation into a more efficient and modern model. First, he ended a series of costly wars with Poland and Muscovy, allowing him the time to reorganize the military. He also set up trade deals with other European powers in order to bring Swedish industrial capacity to the necessary levels to maintain his planned reforms. Now, what were these reforms? Well, first off, the military would be made into a professional force rather than relying on part time feudal levies for limited campaigns. Sweden and Finland would be divided into cantons. Each canton would be responsible for raising and maintaining a select number of soldiers who would then be trained as, well, professional soldiers. They would be organized into smaller regiments along the lines of the Dutch model pioneered by Maurice of Nassau, rather than in the large pikes formations used by the Spanish tercios and other places as well, but mostly in Spain. Which was, again, the most common form of warfare at the time. The men raised, their full-time job was that of a soldier, so they had no other concerns. They didn't have a farm to return to in time for harvest. They didn't have another trade they had to participate in. Their entire world was that of warfare and of being a professional soldier, which was actually a major cause for desertions. People would oftentimes be raised for a single campaign, and then upon the end of that campaign, or say harvest time came around, they would leave so they could go back to be with their families and to basically, do their full-time job. So now they didn't have to worry about that anymore. Their job was to stand in line and do what they were told by their instructors, and they basically trained. And train they did. So their tactics relied very heavily on drill and discipline, which was based on the Roman model. This drill and discipline allowed the Swedish military to perform tactics that other militaries found difficult. For example, moving from one formation to another, they were able to fire and load their pieces much more quickly, and they were able to maneuver much more effectively than other armies at the time. The main tactic used by Gustavus Adolphus and the Swedish military relied heavily on shock and awe, or as we would call today, shock and awe, but also violence of action, and basically just overwhelming your enemy with firepower and just violence of action. And what specifically did he do? Well, I'm glad you asked. Okay, specifics, done with the administration stuff. Let's get down to the interesting part. Okay, so first off, we have the infantry. Like other armies at the time, he used the standard pike and shot formations where you have some units using pikes, which are basically long spears anywhere from 15 to 18 feet in length. Some people say longer, but these are absurdly long pikes. You guys know what a pike is. And along with the matchlock musket. However, Gustavus Adolphus placed a higher emphasis on firepower than previous armies. He increased the ratio of muskets to pikes to about 2 to 1, so 2 musketeers for every 1 pikeman, which was something that had not been done before. Usually it was about a 1-to-1 ratio, and actually even earlier than this, there was actually the ratio with 2 pikes would actually be higher. There would be more pikes than muskets. Now, through constant drilling, they were able to increase the rate of fire, which meant that they were able to take up a wider frontage, which meant more lead at any given point was going down range. And they were eventually able to reduce the total number of ranks from 6 muskets deep to eventually only 3 ranks deep.
Adolphus pioneered new methods for maximizing the efficiency of his musketeers. So they are arranged here, 1, 2, 3. These are Warhammer minis. You got Cadian shock troopers, Armageddon Steel Legion up front. That's what I got, people. I got pike and shot over here, but these guys are easier to maneuver. It's just better that way. Any case, just pretend that these are muskets. They'd be arranged in rows like this, 3 ranks deep. And now, normally the muskets would go through a process known as countermarching. It's something that Maurice of Nassau pioneered, and it caught on pretty well after that. What happened is basically what happened is the front rank would fire, and then after they'd fire, they'd go to the back of the line. They'd slip through the gaps, between the ranks, and they go to the back. And as soon as they cleared the front line here, the second line here would open fire. And then once these guys got to the back, they would start reloading, and then these guys would open fire, and then they would rotate to the back again, slipping through the gaps, between the lines. It'd be a lot more elegant than this. This is just a quick demonstration. I don't know how to do that animation stuff. I don't have the program for it, and I don't feel like learning anyway because I'm a boomer. In any case, they'd clear, they'd get to the back, and then these guys would open fire. So through discipline and drill, they'd be able to keep up a constant barrage on the enemy. Now, the Swedish were able to do this, and they did do this. However, Gustavus devised a method to make this even more efficient and even more aggressive. And it's pretty much the exact same thing, but in reverse. So what they would do is the front rank here, let's just say that this started out here, this is the front rank, they would open fire. So boom, they'd all shoot. Instead of rotating to the back and wasting time rotating, they would immediately begin the very long, cumbersome process of reloading. So open fire, they'd reload. Then the second rank would slip through the gaps, moving forward this time. And then the third rank, of course, would close up. These guys, the front rank, the second rank, they move to the front. They would open fire, and then they would immediately begin the cumbersome reloading process. And then the guys here in the back, they'd move to the front, again slipping through the gaps in the line. There's not a lot of space here, but they move to the front, and they would open fire when they get to the front. So this had the combined advantages of faster reloading time, since you didn't have to waste time countermarching. You can, as soon as you shoot, you immediately start the reloading process. And also, if you'll notice, the formation is continually moving forward, which means as they're putting fire on the enemy, they're getting closer and closer to the enemy, putting pressure on them, thereby increasing the accuracy. These things are horrifyingly inaccurate, but distance does help. So the closer you get, of course, the more accurate it's going to be. And you're able to just keep putting pressure on your enemies. And that was really a mainstay of Swedish tactics at the time. Constantly pressing your enemy, constantly being aggressive, and using firepower to your advantage. And again, like I said before, they probably had an advantage in firepower over their opponents. And because of this, they were able to really put a lot more pressure on the enemy, basically force the enemy into positions that they weren't most suited.
So the pikes would be used to defend the musketeers from enemy counterattacks, particularly that of cavalry, and they could either be used as part of this rolling barrage, slowly pressing on the enemy, or they could close up and form a single rank and fire a single massive volley, in which case the musketeers would then charge in using probably their muskets as clubs. You just basically grab them by the barrel and swing it there, or you can also use swords or whatever hand weapons they had. Along with the pikes, they would then charge in all at once after this massive volley. And to support them in this, they used artillery, which brings us to the next point. Yes, artillery. Let's go talk about some cannons. Most guns of the era were made from cast iron, which made them very heavy and very difficult to move. Now, you could set them up at the start of a battle, but usually once you put them there, they, you say on a ridge line or a hilltop or some prominent location like that, they would more or less be stuck there for the course of the battle. It required teams of oxen or draft horses to be able to move them, and honestly, during a battlefield, during battlefield conditions, moving them was simply not an option. They could be used for counter battery fire, basically taking out the enemy's artillery, and if, say, something like a pike block or some other formation came within their field of fire, yes, they could shoot at that as well, but basically their use was limited due to the ever-changing nature of battlefields. Troops are moving around, constantly shifting, and situations are constantly evolving, and artillery simply could not adapt to it. And this was unacceptable to Gustavus Adolphus and his maneuver-based warfare. So there were experiments with lighter guns. First off, you have what you see here. This is a leather gun, and no, it is not actually made of leather. It's a relatively thin copper tube, which was bound with cord, and then over the top of that would have a covering of leather. And it was much lighter than the cast iron guns, and it was much more mobile. However, it was not particularly successful. The big thing is that it had a major problem with overheating. As you can imagine, controlling an explosion of gunpowder, it generates a tremendous amount of heat, and it didn't cool down enough leather. As anybody who wears leather can tell you, it does not breathe very well. So this led to the warping of the relatively thin copper tubing, and basically this could lead to an explosion. Basically, you got a pipe bomb potentially on your hands, and that could, well, that's a bad, you're having a bad day. Let's just leave it at that. So this eventually led to the creation of bronze. Bronze, of course, is a much lighter metal than iron is, so cannons made out of bronze could be transported much more easily than their iron counterparts. This meant that they could maneuver with the army and adapt to the ever-changing battlefield conditions. They would be carried on two-wheeled carts that could be pulled by one or two horses instead of an entire team, or, if the situation called for it, by a small group of soldiers. Each infantry regiment would have attached to them a pair of 4-pound field artillery pieces, and this would provide mobile artillery support for each regiment. So as each regiment would maneuver, there would, of course, be the main battery, which would be firing the heavier stuff, but each infantry regiment, as it would maneuver, would have its own fire support there along with it. Now, when I say 4-pound, I just wanted to make this clear. Just a bit of an aside here. This was pretty much the standard way to measure the caliber and the size of artillery pieces. It wasn't so much the caliber per se. It was actually more of the weight of the shot that was fired. So you have basically a sphere of cast iron, that would be the cannonball, and a 4-pound gun would fire a sphere that weighed 4 pounds. This is actually, as far as cannons go, it's not particularly large, but, what do you want for a mobile artillery piece? Someone says, and not just in this context, but basically this is true all the way through the 19th century, something like, say, a 20-pounder, that means it's large enough to fire a sphere of 20-pound, a 20-pound cast iron ball. 34-pound gun fires a 34-pound shot, etc., etc., etc. So when someone says this is the size of a gun, this is the weight of the gun, like a 20-pounder, it's the weight of the shot it fires, not the actual gun itself. Just keep that in mind. In addition to the smaller artillery pieces that would be attached to the infantry regiments, there would also be the larger cannons, which would make up the main battery. These would be standardized into 24 and 12 pounds, which did ease logistics, and logistics is pretty much what makes or breaks militaries. So by having them in a standard size, it streamlined logistics and just made things much easier for Swedish quartermasters, much to their relief. Instead of trying to figure out, a myriad of different calibers, like you either got a 24-pounder, you got a 12-pounder, or you got a 4-pounder. Okay, you have shot for those. Those are the only cannonballs you have to worry about getting the ammunition for. You don't have to worry about anything else. Made things a lot easier for them. And this, of course, brings us to the final branch of service. We are looking at the cavalry. Now, like the rest of his army, Gustavus Adolphus' cavalry was based on shock and awe, basically firepower and bringing as much violence to bear in the shortest amount of time possible. Now, at this point, cavalry would be used oftentimes in the caracal formation, and the Swedish cavalry would do this as well. Now, I have another video on cavalry during this era, which I do briefly go over this, and I'll briefly go over it again here. And I'm going to use some models. Okay, here we go.
Okay, so once again, I have my miniatures here. They are set up. Pretend these are cavalry. I don't have any horsemen at all. I have a couple tanks and stuff like that, but I don't have any horses at all. I don't know why, because, I don't know, I just never bought them. Any case, they would be arranged much deeper than this, but you still get the basic idea. Just 2 ranks here. It's easier for me to maneuver that way. Any case, they would be armed with wheel-lock pistols, which were basically wind-up guns. You would wind them up and you'd fire them. They're very delicate, they never really caught on in any extensive manner, but that's another discussion for another day. Any case, they would ride up, and much like the muskets would rotate, they would rotating muskets. What they would do is they would fire, the first ring would fire, and then these guys would peel off to the side, and then go to the back, and then again, reloading the entire time. As soon as they fire, they reload. The next rank would move up, and then these guys would fire, and then they'd move to the back, and then they'd rotate, and then the rest of the line would move forward, and again, it would constantly be this motion. So they'd constantly be moving forward. So they'd constantly be moving forward, firing, and then moving to the back. Moving forward, firing, and then peeling off the side and moving to the back. I know it's not very elegant, but it's me we're talking about here. Budget operation.
So that's just a very brief look at the caracal formation. I do go into more detail. I have a dedicated video about cavalry during this era, so you should probably check that out. But Gustavus Adolphus did look at the caracal, and yes, the Swedish did use the caracal from time to time, but it's not the most efficient use of cavalry's advantages. So, possibly inspired by the Polish armored lancers that he fought against, better known as the Winged Hussars, which, oh, by the way, I have a video about. You should totally check that out. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Any case, he used them as a shock force. Now, before we get into that, they would oftentimes be used, or the main priority of Swedish cavalry would be as a blocking force against enemy cavalry. So there'd be the infantry would form up the center of an army with cavalry on both wings, and their job would be to provide this blocking force and prevent the infantry from being rolled up the flanks by the enemy cavalry, which is pretty much standard throughout history. Cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the middle, that's nothing particularly noteworthy there. And like the rest of his army, the second priority of the cavalry was that of a shock force. They would have their pistols, and in addition to the cavalry, each cavalry regiment or each cavalry unit would have a detachment of musketeers along with them. And this would provide them extra fire support. So should, say, for example, the enemy cavalry attack the wings, you'd have the firepower of the horsemen themselves with their wheel-lock pistols, as well as muskets there along with them, giving that extra firepower. And also, when they go on the offensive, the rolling barrage of these musketeers would weaken the enemy, or they could, again, like with just the regular pike and shot infantry regiments, fire a single massive blast, followed through with the pistols of the cavalrymen themselves, basically everybody firing all at once, this massive wall of lead. And while the enemy is still reeling from this, this massive impact, the Swedish cavalry would then draw their swords and charge in. Don't give the enemy a chance to reform. Just charge directly in and exploit any confusion and hopefully roll up the enemy's flanks. And this leads to the final reform of Gustavus Adolphus, the utilization of combined arms. Now, combined arms is not something particularly new. It's actually been around since as long as there had been organized warfare. You have cavalry, infantry, artillery, ranged units, archers, crossbowmen, skirmishers, what have you. All of them working together and working in conjunction with one another and minimizing their weaknesses and maximizing their strengths. So infantry, spearmen providing a solid defense, cavalry being a mobile shock force, artillery blasting holes in enemy lines, archers attacking from a distance. You should pretty much know what combined arms is. We use it today. I mean, it's commonplace today. It's nothing particularly new about this, but he did use it to a more extensive degree than had been previously used. And you had been seeing this. Infantry would be supported by artillery. It had its own artillery pieces that moved along with it. Cavalry had its own detachment of musketeers that moved along with it. And this was the key to Gustavus Adolphus' success. Combined arms had been used by militaries again throughout history, but it was utilized by Gustavus Adolphus to an extent that had not been seen before, and something that his enemies were simply unable to counteract. So, for example, at the Battle of Breitenfeld, which was his greatest victory, and I'm not going to break down the entire battle because that's just going to take such a long time, and I might do it eventually, but I'm not going to do it here. But in any case, the Imperial army that the Swedish army was up against did use combined arms, but not to the same extent. So there would be attacks on the wings. For example, Duke Pappenheim kept launching attacks against the Swedish right wing, and he kept getting repulsed because they had the firepower of both the cavalrymen and the musketeers, and the unsupported cavalry of Pappenheim was unable to compete with this. The infantry in the center, attacking in these large tercios, couldn't compete with the massed firepower of the musketeers, as well as the mobile artillery pieces. Now, on the left wing of the battlefield, the allies of the Swedes, the Saxons, unfortunately did not go through these reforms, and when they were hit by an imperial assault, they broke and ran. Now, this actually belies the final aspect of Gustavus Adolphus's reforms, and that would be command and control. You see, the night before the battle, they actually planned for this. The Swedish army and the Swedish High Command went through a number of scenarios, and all of the sub-commanders knew exactly what they had to do. There was really no improvising. So they already knew that should the left wing break, move reinforcements to that point. And that's exactly what General Gustavus Horn did. As soon as the Saxon allies broke and ran, he immediately, using these linear formations, again made up of smaller battalions that are faster and easier to maneuver, pushed them right into the breach that was caused in the line from these guys breaking. And while the Imperials were still trying to reform themselves after routing the Saxons, they were set upon by the Swedish reserves and driven from the battlefield. So with the attack on the left blunted, the center holding steady, The right wing, which was commanded by Gustavus Adolphus himself, him and his cavalrymen, along with the supporting musketeers, gave a single massive volley from their guns, and they then slammed into the Imperial left. And with that, they simply rolled up the enemy's flank, and, well, they won the victory. That's a vast oversimplification of the battle. I might break it down, I might not, probably not. I don't know. I have to learn how to do animation, which I probably won't. But the Battle of Breitenfeld really showed the success of the Swedish military machine and the success of these new linear formations on a grand scale. Again, it had been used by the Dutch during the Dutch Revolt, but it really didn't gain that much traction outside of a few select areas. And this really just showed all Europe that this is the future of warfare. Now, the Swedish war machine would not be invincible, and these new linear formations with their combined arms would be defeated actually by an Imperial Tercio or Tercio-based army at the Battle of Nordlingen. But with such setbacks aside, it really showed that this was the new way of warfare, and Gustavus Adolphus's methods that he pioneered and basically brought to the fore would be the standard of warfare, at least until the end of the 17th century. And because of his reforms, Gustavus Adolphus is known to history as the father of modern warfare. So, in any case, that is it for this video. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it. And have a good day. Or don't have a good day. You're adults. You can have any kind of day you want. See you later.